Hello, Internet. Welcome to Current Conflicts, the channel where we discuss strategic, operational, and most importantly, logistical aspects of the ongoing conflicts in our ever more difficult and dangerous world. I was working on a video about the potentially upcoming China invasion of Taiwan, how that could bring the U.S. into it, and all the sort of nonsense associated with that. While doing that, sort of in the background, I was listening to the Lex Fridman Zelenskyy podcast, and boy, there's a lot there. And I want to go over some of it really quick because Lex Fridman makes some wild statements and has some pretty interesting opinions on a lot of this stuff. So, Lex, I don't love you. I respect you. And before I get too critical, I want to say I very much appreciate Lex Fridman for what he does. Great mind, great interviewer, but this is unbelievably tone deaf, and just frankly, some of the things he says are just insane on the face of them. So I have some notes here I'm going to refer to. The first thing I want to talk about is there's a Russian word. The word is vranyo, and I'm certain I'm mispronouncing that. Make sure you tell me how wrong I am in the comments section down below. This is a word that means lie that everyone knows is a lie. I'm lying to you. You know I'm lying to you. I know you know. It's almost a lie as a challenge. And this goes back to the Soviet times. This is the way the Russians negotiate, right? Yeah, I'm lying. What are you going to do about it? I'm in a position of strength. So the idea that you can have honest negotiations with the Russians, particularly Putin, is just, it's insane. It's an insane statement. It goes against the history of what's happened, what he's done. It's just nonsense. He's lying. He's a liar. How do you believe a liar? How do you listen to a liar? How do you take what a liar says seriously? Right? A proven liar. Yeah, that's a whole mess. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but that's a whole mess. I want to sort of conceptualize this, particularly for Americans who don't really understand what's going on over there off in the far-flung corners of Europe that doesn't really matter to us. I live in Texas. I know Lex lives in Texas. I think I'm significantly closer to the border than he is. How Sarah Palin could see Russia from her house, well, I can see Mexico from my house, right? Very, very close. The arguments that Putin is making are all the same arguments that the Mexican government could make about the former territories of Mexico. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. All these territories used to be part of Mexico. What would we do if we were in a weakened military position and the Mexicans were in a strong military position, right? And I understand this is unrealistic, right? It's chaos over there. There's a lot of stuff going on in Mexico. But these are the same arguments that Putin is making, right? These historical arguments about language, right? What if the Mexican government was to say, we're going there to save the Mexicans that speak Spanish. All these people are Mexicans. They belong back under our control. These people, because of their language, because of their history, because of the territory's history, these places belong to us. And we're going to take them back. How would we respond to that? Right? And what if they were arming the cartels, right? Arming the cartels to come over here and kill us and create separatist movements in these disputed territories of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. How do we respond to that? And let's take it a step further and say that they fully militarily invaded these territories and were occupying them, right? They moved north of the Rio Grande. They moved up into Texas proper, into New Mexico proper, into Arizona and California, moving all up and down that front. How would we respond to that? That's what's happening in Ukraine, right? The parties are different, but that's what's happening over there. And even worse, what if they were taking the children that they captured and moving them out of the border regions deep into Mexico to re-educate them to be proper Mexicans? Because that's what the Russians are doing. We wouldn't stand for that. We would not tolerate that for a minute. You don't think we'd fight to the last man to push them out, to stop the killing? And not only that, but they had been disingenuous with us in their negotiations before. Would we just believe and come to a ceasefire and just unilaterally stop shooting? That's insane. That's an insane thing to try to require of somebody. So I think people need to understand what's going on over there and have some context to where they can relate this stuff to. Zelenskyy makes a really good comparison to Israel. And I think this is really important. I think Ukraine, like Israel, the Israelis have realized this, that allies are not to be relied upon. This is why Israel has such good domestic military production, arms production. Their Iron Dome system is arguably the best in the world. Yeah, they buy a lot of American weapons. That's great for our business. It's great for our security. And it gives us a degree of control over the Israelis to prevent them from going too far. And sometimes they do go too far. But a strong and free Israel is strong and free because of their military strength, because of their domestic military production. They don't have to ask anybody for anything. They can just do it. They use a lot of our weapon systems very, very effectively. I might add F-15, F-35. These are excellent weapon systems the United States has sold to Israel, and they've used in their ongoing wars against Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and its proxies in the area. A strong and free Israel is important to the region, an important U.S. ally. It's important to our interests in the region. A strong and free Ukraine is similarly important, not only to stop the Russians, but to protect Europe proper, to bring them into the fold. They're not asking for a handout. They're not asking for... They want to fight. This is not Afghanistan where we left and the army just collapsed, right? Where we just dumped billions of dollars and just left billions of dollars, abandoned weapons that could be used against us again. This is a different situation. Lex also makes some, let's say, interesting arguments for, he says, India and Saudi Arabia. That's insane on the face of it. All right, that shows a fundamental lack of understanding about history, alliances, and how these countries ally. India and China have been the number one and number two importer of sanctioned Russian oil, and they've been making a killing off of it. Saudi Arabia is in OPEC with the Russians, right? The oil cartel that is trying to drive up the price of oil. The idea that these countries would be willing to support Ukraine over Russia in any kind of conflict is insane. It's an insane thing to say. It's an insane thing to think. Not only that, but the Indians are the number one procurer of Russian military equipment. They have so much Russian military equipment, from the Cold War to that stupid aircraft carrier that doesn't really work. It's a massive quantity. The T-90 tanks that don't work up in the mountains. It's a massive quantity of military dependency that the Indians have on the Russians. The idea that they would choose a country that they don't really trade with, they don't really have any history with, that they've never been allied with over the Russians is absolute madness. It's madness. The Saudis, let's say for the sake of argument that the Saudis would, which they probably wouldn't. Let's say they did choose Ukraine over Russia. What can the Saudis provide as far as security is concerned? They produce oil. They produce a lot of oil. The Russians also produce a lot of oil. The Russians don't need the Saudis for anything except to be in that cartel with them. The Saudis don't produce any domestic military technology. They buy most of it from the United States. So somehow the idea that these countries would be a bulwark against Russian aggression is just madness. It's madness. It's insane on the face of it. Another thing Lex does in this is he compares the American and the Russian military adventures, right? He talks about Iraq and Afghanistan and war is terrible and all this sort of thing. And yeah, war is a terrible, terrible thing. But the way you fight the war matters. The way that democracies fight wars matters. The restrictions we put on ourselves matter. There's an old historical saying that the Romans create a wasteland and call it peace. Well, the Russians create a wasteland and call it peace. If you look at any of the cities that the Russians have taken over, from Syria, Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, they're an artillery army. They just blow the place apart with artillery. They don't really care who's there. The Russians are firing hundreds of these semi-precision drones every night into Ukraine. They don't care who they hit. They're taking some of their limited production, very expensive, very precise weapons and firing at them at things like hospitals and schools and book factories. It's an imperial army, okay? The army of a democracy does not fight that way. The United States does its best to ensure the lives of its own soldiers first, right? And then to ensure the lives of civilians as best they can. Yeah, war is hell, and people are going to die. But there's a difference between trying, at least trying, right? Trying to minimize the civilian casualties, the civilian suffing, to move equipment, civilian infrastructure back in there after the fighting's over as quickly as possible to minimize civilian casualties. The Russians do none of this. And that ties into my last point, that Putin loves his country, that Putin is somehow a great lover of his country. It's just patently false. It's just patently false. A man who loves his country does not behave the way that Putin behaves. You don't send your young men to go die if you love them. Not in the way that he sends them. Not in these human wave attacks. They've been so badly battered by the Ukrainians. They've not completely, but essentially run out of a lot of this old Soviet military equipment, their old armored personnel carriers and things. They're sending these boys across these fields into machine gun fire, mortar fire, and artillery fire on motorcycles and electric golf carts that they get from the Chinese. It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. There's a thing that happens with autocrats where they start to confuse the country for themselves. I think it was Louis XIV who said, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, right? Well, in his mind, Putin is the state. Yeah, Putin loves his country in that way. He loves himself. He loves his life. He's terrified of what happened to Gaddafi. If you've ever seen the footage of what happened to Gaddafi, but he's terrified something like that will happen to him. So yeah, he loves his country if his country is being himself. He loves his friends. He loves his boyars, his nobles, right? The new nobility that he has set up over there. Yeah, he loves those people. But the idea that Putin is a great lover of country is just insane and false, demonstrably so. And the idea that we have to approach this and approach Putin as if he is a democratically elected leader and great lover of country it's nonsense. It's a nonsense idea that somehow these sides are equal. Russia does not need security guarantees. Russia is the aggressor and has been the aggressor and will continue to be the aggressor. Europe needs security guarantees. The Baltics need security guarantees. Poland needs security guarantees. This idea that Putin is a great lover of country is just false. It's just nonsense. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous to think, and it's dangerous to say, and it's dangerous to engage in negotiations if you think like that. So, yeah, that's what I got to say about that. I know I'm getting a little long-winded here. If you like what I said, hit the like button. If you didn't like what I said, hit the dislike button. Make sure you tell me how wrong I am in the comment section down below. And look forward to the rest of my videos coming out. I'm really going to be focusing mostly on the Chinese because that seems to be where Trump wants to focus. And yeah, if you like it, subscribe and wait for more.